Okay, squad, welcome back to the ODR in the front yard, and it's time for my first official video on the ODR channel, where today I'm going to be going over the cast for Survivor 50, also known as Survivor in the Hands of the Fans, which I'm not really sure if this cast was in the hands of the fans per se. Spoiler alert, there will be a couple of people that I talk about that were not in the official cast, but let's get into the official cast. We have 24 people in the cast, and I'm going to be giving my personal thoughts on each member of the cast. So let's get started. So starting off from the very beginning, we have Survivor Borneo, where we do have one person on the cast, and it's not the person I personally would have liked to see on the cast. I would have liked to see someone like a Greg be on the cast, but the person we did get on the cast I am not entirely opposed to, and that is Jenna Lewis. And again, I am not entirely opposed to seeing Jenna Lewis on the cast. She played pretty hard in All Stars. I don't think her Borneo game was particularly that great, but then again, none of the other Pagong members really played that great either. But seeing Jenna compete for the third time would definitely be quite the experience, especially considering that she's gone the longest out of any of the players in question between seasons. She hasn't competed since All Stars, and that was 20 years ago. I'm not entirely sure if Jenna will play as hard as she did in All Stars, but her third chance will definitely be something to watch. Next up, we move on to the Australian Outback, where we do have one representative from the season on the cast. I know some people were talking about maybe Elizabeth would be coming back, but I wasn't super keen on it. I wouldn't have been opposed to it like I was with Jenna Lewis, but I think the pick that we did get is a questionable pick in the grander scheme of things, but we did get Colby Donaldson, who also competed in All Stars and Heroes vs. Villains. And do we really need this pick? I do understand if they were going to pick someone from the Australian Outback, it would most likely be Colby, considering how Jeff talked about Colby from the Australian Outback. But after All Stars and Heroes vs. Villains, it kind of seemed like Jeff's opinion of Colby did dwindle a little bit. So this is more of a questionable pick, but it's not the worst pick on the board. I will say that. There are worse picks on the board. But do we really need Colby to compete for a fourth time? Especially considering the fact that him and Jenna Lewis are the only two competitors from pre-All-Stars. So they've already competed more than once. And for Colby, this will be 4 times. But he hasn't competed since Heroes vs. Villains, and we'll see if he adapts his strategy, but I'm not too keen on this pick. It's not the worst pick on the board, but I did expect a little bit better. As I said earlier, there weren't any picks from pre-All-Stars besides Jenna and Colby, so that means we didn't get any picks from Survivor Africa, we didn't get any picks from Survivor Marquesas, even though I would have really liked to see Sean Rector come back. We didn't get any picks from Survivor Thailand, but let's be real, nobody wanted anybody back from that season anyway. Except for maybe like a Sheehan, and even then, I don't really think she was in the pool anyway. We didn't get any picks from Survivor the Amazon, which is really disappointing considering the fact that Rob Cesternino isn't on this cast. And I've seen a couple comments saying that this truly would have been an in the hands of the fans cast if Rob Cesternino was on it, at least to an extent. And we also didn't get anyone from Pearl Islands. I personally would have liked to see someone like maybe a Burton come back, and I know production isn't too keen on Johnny Fairplay anymore, so that was never on the table. But to not get anyone from Pearl Islands was a little bit of a surprise, but also not, considering the age of the players now. And the main reason I bring that up is because this is a season that Jeff Probst has openly talked about as being really good. So to see no one get cast from it was a little bit of a surprise, but again, at the same time, not really. Beyond that, we also didn't get any players from Survivor Vanuatu, which was not really a surprise considering how Jeff has openly not liked the season. I personally think it's a pretty decent season, but Jeff wasn't going to bring anyone back from Vanuatu. But then we get to Survivor Palau, and we do have one member of the cast on Survivor 50. And who would have guessed it? We have Stephanie LaGrossa, who I think if you were going to put one person from Survivor Palau on Survivor 50, it would make sense to put Stephanie. Maybe like a Tom Westman could have been in the mix, or possibly even Ian, but I don't know how high production was on this season. And I am am interested to see Stephanie play again, especially having seen her play on other reality shows like The Traitors and Snake in the Grass, where she was terrible. But like Colby, Stephanie hasn't played since Heroes vs. Villains, and her Heroes vs. Villains game was a mess. Maybe not as much of a mess as other players on the cast, but still a mess. But Stephanie, again, hasn't played in 15 years, so I think this pick is a pretty good pick. I am interested to see how she could play with a fourth chance. She's one of the few people on this cast who is playing Survivor for the fourth time instead of for the third or second. So I think this is a good pick. But besides Stephanie, we didn't get anyone coming back from Survivor Guatemala. I would have really liked to see Brian on the cast, considering how he dominated the pre-merge of Survivor Guatemala in his own way. Or I would have liked to see someone like a Judd come back, considering how much of a character he was. But I do kind of understand why production didn't bring any of them back. But then we get to Survivor Panama, where we do have one person from this season on the cast of Survivor 50, and truthfully, I think this person was always a lock to be on Survivor 50. And that, of course, is the legend herself, Cirie Fields. Now, the only gripe I have with this is that Cirie has already played Survivor 4 times, and she'll be appearing on Australian Survivor USA versus the World. So, I know the question out there is, do we really need another season of Cirie? And it's not just Survivor that she's competed on either. She's competed on Big Brother, she's competed on The Traitors, which she actually won, and that was very exciting to see. But on Survivor, she hasn't really had the same luck. So, the main question I have is the fifth time the time that Cirie finally does it and wins Survivor? And in my opinion, I think it's not going to happen. Now, is it out of the question? No. But is it likely? Also no. That being said, I do think this is a good pick and one that makes a lot of sense. Some might not see it that way because they're kind of sick of seeing Cirie on the screen, but I like it. I think it's a good pick. It makes a lot of sense. Next up, we have Survivor Cook Islands, where we did get one member of this season on the cast of Survivor 50, though not the person I think many people were expecting to be on the cast, because many people wanted Jonathan Penner to be on the cast, and unfortunately, he wasn't, and I think it's disappointing because the person that we got in his place was Ozzy. And I'm going to have to hard disagree with this pick. Not just because Ozzy isn't the greatest TV character in the world, but also because the story is going to be the exact same thing for him over and over again. We saw it play out in Cook Islands, where he came one vote away, but had to rely on challenges just to get all the way to the end. In Micronesia, he's blindsided in a 5-4 vote against someone who was really bad at the game. In South Pacific, he's voted out twice, one of which he did kind of request, but the other one was because he was a strategic threat, and despite returning from Redemption Island twice, he still doesn't get to the end and he's voted out of the final tribal council. And then in Game Changers, it's the same story as Micronesia, although less of a blindside and more of a consensus target. So I really don't think Ozzy has it in him to win this time. How far he'll go, I don't know, but I think it's going to be the same story. He gets to some point in the merge and then he's voted out. It's not the most interesting story in the world, and again, Ozzy's character status is a little bit up in the air, so I really don't like this pick. I would have preferred to see someone else. Then we get to Survivor Fiji, which, no surprise, there was nobody from Survivor Fiji on the cast. I would have liked to see someone like an Earl play again, but unfortunately, we didn't get that. We also didn't get anybody from Survivor China, where I know Amanda Kimmel was in the conversation at one point, and at one point I think she was actually on the cast, but she had to pull out. And it would have been interesting to see some of the other characters compete again, like Courtney or even Todd for that matter. Todd would have been insane to see, but he hasn't competed again, so whatever. And then in Micronesia, there have been none of the fans that have been recast on Survivor 50, to the point where it is a little bit disappointing, especially considering that I would have liked to see someone like a Natalie Bolton come back, but that didn't happen. And then no one from Survivor Gabon was cast either, to where I would have liked to see someone like a Kenny come back, and that didn't happen either. But then we get to Survivor Tocantins, where we did have one person on the cast, and this is definitely one of the greater seasons of Survivor. Definitely a couple characters. There was no Taj on the season, which was somewhat disappointing, but I think the person that we got more than makes up for it. And of course, we got Coach, who is one of the most insane characters in Survivor history in a good way, so it would make sense that they did put him on Survivor 50, and I am looking forward to seeing it, especially since Coach is another one of these people that hasn't competed in a long time. He hasn't competed since South Pacific, and I think his games have just gotten better and better, maybe except for his Heroes vs. Villains game compared to his Tocantins game, but his South Pacific game was really strong, and I am wondering how he'll do on a return. This will be his 4th time competing, and will he win? I don't know, but he definitely has it in him to go far. He could be a consensus target, though, right off the bat, considering his status, but it's not a guarantee, and I really would like to see Coach make another deep run. But then we get into the part of the list which is just ridiculous, because we go on a long stretch of seasons that don't have any returning players, starting with Survivor Samoa, which does make a little bit of sense. I would have liked to see someone like a Brett Klauser maybe make a return, considering how he almost survived the complete pagonging of Galoo, and had he made it to the end, I do think he would have won. But given how much he was purpled in the edit in Survivor Samoa, I didn't think he stood a chance. And there weren't really any others that I would have considered for Samoa besides him, but I wasn't really too high on that. Next up, we have Survivor Nicaragua, and to no one's surprise, nobody made it onto Survivor 50. It would have been somewhat interesting to see someone like a Chase maybe make a return, especially considering that he was only 1 vote away from winning the game, and a lot of people agreeing, myself included, that he played a much better game than the winner Fabio, but he didn't really stand a chance, especially considering the season that is Nicaragua is just a complete mess. Then there's Survivor Redemption Island, which didn't really have any notable characters besides obviously a Boston Rob and a Phillip, and someone who many people thought would eventually return, that being Natalie Tenerelli. She didn't come back. And beyond that, there weren't really many interesting options to return, especially considering that this is one of the pagonging seasons, this one being a major pagonging, with all the members of Zapatera getting pagonged by Ometepe and Boston Rob, so there weren't really any options for that matter from this season to come back, at least for those who haven't come back already. Then we get to Survivor South Pacific, which besides Coach and Ozzy, who I covered earlier, no one really stood out from this cast, and no one was put on to Survivor 50 as I expected, besides the 2 major players who were returning players. And like Redemption Island, this was a pagonging season where the members of Savai'i got pagonged by the members of Upolu, although I don't think they were keen to bring any of the newbies from this season back, especially not Brandon Hance after everything he's done. No one came back from Survivor One World, which wasn't a surprise to me either, considering that I think this season is trash. But the cast did have some pretty good members of it besides Kim Spradlin, who's already come back, like Sabrina, who was considered for Survivor Cambodia, but didn't get the chance to compete. But it's not surprising that nobody came back from Survivor One World, so let's just move on. We also didn't get anyone from Survivor Philippines, which I think is one of the bigger surprises on the board, considering that they had the opportunity to put someone like a Malcolm on, even though he's already competed 3 times. They could have put on an Abby Maria, I've heard the community say, but no one from this season came back, which was a little disappointing. Then there's Survivor Caramoan, which I don't think a lot of the fans really had a shot to come back. I've already covered most of the favorites, so let's move on from this season as well. They didn't bring anyone back from Blood vs. Water, which wasn't much of a surprise, I don't think, at least compared to the newbies. I didn't really think much of the newbies stood much of a chance, maybe except for someone like Avidas possibly, but he already competed in Cambodia, so again, let's move on. Then we get to Survivor Cagayan, and they did not cast anyone from Cagayan, which I think is the biggest surprise on the board, considering the amount of characters that they had. Now, yes, a lot of them did compete on later seasons, like you had Tony compete on Game Changers and Winners at War. You had Wu and Cass and Tasha all compete on Cambodia. You even had Spencer compete on Cambodia, and I thought Spencer definitely would have made it into Survivor 50, especially considering the fact that Survivor was more than willing to bring back people who have competed twice, 3 times, even 4 times for that matter. But I guess that wasn't the case. And it's really disappointing because this is one of the greatest Survivor seasons of all time, and to not have anyone from it is just mind-boggling. Less surprising, though, was the fact that we didn't get anyone from San Juan del Sur. I thought they maybe could have put a Natalie Anderson on the cast, but she was also on Winners at War, so... And even if she did compete on this cast, I think she probably would have been picked off due to her status as a former winner. So let's move on. The last non-returnee season to have nobody cast was Survivor Worlds Apart. And again, this is not a surprise. The cast in this season was pretty ugly. You have some really ugly personalities like a Rodney and a Dan Foley. So it's no surprise that nobody from this season got cast on Survivor 50. But then we finally break the Survivor seasons that don't have any returnees for Survivor 50 with Survivor Kaôh Rōng. And I think, straight up, this is the most questionable pick of all of the cast of Survivor 50. But in the end, they did put on Aubrey Bracco, which... why? The issue for me is not that this will be Aubrey's fourth time competing. We've seen other people in the list compete for their fourth time on Survivor 50, or what will be their fourth time competing. People like a Colby and a Coach. This will be their fourth time competing, and this will also be Aubrey's fourth time competing. But the problem is, do we really need Aubrey to compete for a fourth time? Yes, she probably was the most deserving winner of Kaôh Rōng, at least when it comes to the final three. But I just don't see the potential for Aubrey to not only do that well in the game of Survivor, but also to be great TV. So I really think this is a questionable pick and probably the worst of all the picks of Survivor 50. But then we get to Survivor Millennials versus Gen X, which had no returnees, which was disappointing because I would have liked to see someone like a David Wright return from Millennials versus Gen X, but we didn't get that. And that's even though he did compete on Edge of Extinction. But beyond David, there weren't really many interesting characters from the season, even though the season's good, but nobody came back. Then there's Survivor HHH, which did have one returning player from the cast, and I feel like this returning player was pretty obvious when you compare it to the rest of the cast, and that is Chrissy Hoffbeck, which it was pretty obvious that Chrissy was going to compete again at some point. Some people think that she should have won the season. I personally don't agree with that. I don't think Chrissy would have won HHH or should have won, nor should Ben for that matter. But I do think Chrissy would be an interesting player to see on a return and see how she'll navigate the game. I haven't watched much of HHH, but I do plan to rewatch it at some point, so we'll see how Chrissy does. Then there's Survivor Ghost Island, which didn't have any returning players either. And while it is a little disappointing that they didn't bring someone like a Dominic back, I can't really say there were many other players that definitely should have been brought back besides Dominic. So while that is disappointing for the most part, it's not a complete loss. And then there's David versus Goliath, which has 3 returning players from this season. The most of any season, tied with 2 other seasons that I'll be talking about later. So I'll go in boot order for the 3 contestants of David versus Goliath. The first of those being Christian Hubicki, who is one of the most insane characters on Survivor, kind of like Coach, again, in a good way. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing Christian compete again, especially considering that even though his David vs. Goliath game was kind of he did provide for some very good TV moments. Although I do think he could be targeted right away, considering that people will see him as an intellectual and think he's intelligent and all that. And he did almost have a much earlier exit in David vs. Goliath that he prevented by using an immunity idol. But Christian is a great character, and I'm glad we're getting to see more of him. And sticking with the theme of really insane characters, we got our next contestant, who is also an insane character. We got Angelina Keeley, who a couple of people in the Survivor community would argue is the most insane character in all Survivor, again, in a good way. And this is mainly due to the iconic moments that she had, like the whole ladder situation and asking for Natalie's jacket, and many more moments on top of that. So I definitely could see Angelina being more of a comic relief person on the show and definitely making for some interesting TV once again. Though how far she'll go, I'm not really sure to that, but she is definitely going to be a welcome presence on Survivor 50. And then we get to the last member of David vs. Goliath appearing on Survivor 50, one which some people might say is a little bit of a questionable pick, but it's a pick that I personally like, even though this person does have quite the schedule outside of Survivor, and that of course is Mike White, who some of you may know as the producer of The White Lotus, who competed on Survivor, and he almost won Survivor, losing in a 7-3 vote against Nick. And many people, myself included, will argue that Mike actually played a better game than Nick and was a more deserving winner. Now, my main gripe with Mike is that he could be perceived as a physical liability on this cast, especially considering that he's on the older side of things, kind of like Rudy was seen in Survivor All-Stars. But then again, Rudy also injured his ankle, so that didn't help the matter. But I would be intrigued to see how well Mike White could do, and if he could possibly get to the finale again, or maybe we even win the season, I'd be all for it. Next up is Survivor Edge of Extinction, which has the last player on the list before the new era, which is crazy that they have 12 people on the list before the new era and 12 people on the list from the new era. But with that being said, the last player on Survivor 50 from the era before the new era, whatever you want to call it, is Rick Devens. And this was no surprise, especially considering how Jeff has talked about Rick Devens and how Devens is just a really crazy character on Edge of Extinction and almost won the season. And considering the fact that Chris, who won the season, also had to come back into the game like Devens did, I think it was pretty much a lock that Devens was going to be on Survivor 50, and I'm for it. Now, how well he'll do, who knows? He did get voted out early, as I said, and had to come back into the game, and despite that, almost won the game. So it would be interesting to see how he'll do on a season that doesn't have the Edge of Extinction twist to back him up. We'll see what happens. There is, however, one last season before the new era that's not a full returnee season, that being Survivor Island of the Idols, and nobody came back from this season. And plus, this season can go die in a hole anyway, so let's move on to the new era. Starting off the new era, we have Survivor 41, which did not have any returnees, which was a little bit of a surprise to me, but also not at the same time considering how people are not typically high on this season. It would have been nice to bring back someone like Ricard, but we didn't get anyone from this season, so oh well. Moving on to Survivor 42, where we do have one returning cast member from this season. It wasn't the one I was expecting, albeit somewhat. I was expecting them to bring back someone like Omer, considering his level of gameplay and how much of a character he was, but unfortunately, that didn't happen. Though the pick that they did go with was not a horrible pick, and they did end up going with Jonathan Young, who, again, crazy character, crazy challenge performer, a little bit of everything, and I know some people in the Survivor community are relatively high on him, especially from reviewing Survivor 42 in blank minutes. Some people are pretty high on Jonathan. He was an integral part of the Taku 4, ironically alongside Omer, so I definitely think this is a better pick of the new era. There are some better candidates from 42, again, like Omer and a couple of others, but I do think from 42, Jonathan isn't the worst pick, so I look forward to seeing him on this season. Next up, we have Survivor 43, where we didn't have any returning players from Survivor 43, which was really disappointing considering that we didn't get back Cody. We didn't get back Jesse either, and I know Jesse was definitely deep into the casting process only to get eventually cut. So to not get Jesse back and also to not get Cody back to an extent was really disappointing considering their level of gameplay and also character levels as well. And no one came back from 44 either. Now I'm not sure which is more disappointing, the fact that no one came back from 43 or the fact that no one came back from 44. Because both of them, in my opinion, had two major contenders that could have come back for 50. 43 had Cody and Jesse, whereas 44 had Carolyn and Carson. And not only did CBS decide not to bring back one of those pairs, they decided to bring back neither of those pairs, which is a real letdown. Next, we have Survivor 45, where we did get two people from this season on Survivor 50, albeit ones that were slightly questionable, but not completely questionable, though I would have preferred to see some other members of 45 be on this cast. To an extent, it would have been at least somewhat interesting to see members like Julie, Drew, or even Kayla be on the cast. And I'll be honest, this might be a hot take, but I actually really wanted to see Bruce on Survivor 50. Unfortunately, none of those happened, though. Again, the casting choices from 45 weren't the worst. The first one being Emily. And I really don't look too highly upon Emily's game. She was a little bit of a character, but there were better characters from 45. Though I will say this, she didn't want to play Survivor again, so I do wonder what changed her mind. I do also think that part of the reason Emily was cast on 45 was because she was the last surviving member of the Disaster Lulu tribe, but I don't know if that's entirely true. And I do wonder how she'll navigate the game despite only having competed 5 seasons ago. So How it's going to play out for Emily, I'm not exactly sure, but it would be something that will be interesting to see. And then our second representative from Survivor 45 is the winner of the season. We got Dee. And I think Dee is probably the greatest New Era winner, probably up there with Kyle from 48. Though, let's be honest, I highly doubt she is going to win again. Now, it is possible that she keeps the same level of dominant gameplay throughout Survivor 50, but right off the bat, I feel like she's going to be a huge target as a former winner. I also feel like CBS wanted to bring back at least one former winner, preferably from the New Era, so there's that. I do wonder how far Dee can go in the game. Will she form alliances and get all the way to the end or to the merge with it? Or will she be seen as a major target for being a former winner and be taken out early? There's a lot to speculate about Dee's game in Survivor 50 when it comes out, and so how it could go is really up in the air. Next up on the list is Survivor 46, which ties David vs. Goliath for the most returning players from a single Survivor season for Survivor 50 at 3. And there's one more season that I'll be talking about that also has 3 returning players, but again, we're going to be covering these 3 players in boot order, starting with probably the most questionable of the bunch from this season, that being Tiffany. And I feel like the reason Tiffany was brought back was due to them bringing back another person from Survivor 46 who is a much more insane character. Now, Tiffany is a character in her own right, especially considering the whole situation with Banu early on. That's one of her better moments in my opinion and one of the funnier ones. So I do see why Tiffany was brought back, although I do think there were a couple of better options maybe from 46, but Tiffany is definitely higher on the list, especially when compared to some of the other characters who weren't really that important per se to the storyline. So Tiffany is definitely a good choice, and I'm looking forward to seeing her on. Next up, we have someone who, after their season aired, was most likely always a lock to make it onto Survivor 50, and that of course is Q, who might just be the biggest character in the new era of Survivor, with all of his antics, including the antics at the Tevin boot round, where he asked everybody to vote him out, and they don't agree with his wishes, and everybody in the voting booth is saying, oh, that was the dumbest tribal ever, which, let's be real, it was silly, but it just goes to show how much of a character Q is. And in my opinion, you really can't have someone like that not on Survivor 50. So it's a perfect pick, an obvious pick, but also a pick that is really good and, again, really expected. But who cares? It's Survivor 50, they're gonna do what they want, and Q had every right to be on this cast. And the last member of the cast of Survivor 50 from Survivor 46, like Q, also had a right to be on the cast, especially considering how a season ended, and that of course is Charlie, who is so relatable, especially in the aforementioned Tevin boot round where everybody's saying that the tribal was dumb. Charlie is saying what everyone is thinking, and Charlie should have won Survivor 46, and he would have if it hadn't been for Maria just throwing a bitter vote out there to Kenzie. Now, Kenzie isn't a horrible winner per se, but Charlie was definitely more deserving of the win than Kenzie was. But I'm glad Charlie's getting a second chance. Now, I don't know how much of a target will be on his back, considering his status as a runner-up, but it likely won't be as high as someone like Dee, who actually won the game, and I am very excited to see Charlie get a second chance. Maybe he could win the game. I would like to see that, but it's probably out of the question, but again, not entirely. I look forward to it though, and I hope he does go far. Next on the list is Survivor 47, which we did get one person from Survivor 47 on the cast of Survivor 50. The main surprise for me was the fact that they didn't put more people from the season on Survivor 50. I know Rome was contacted at one point, but eventually cut from the cast, and I figured they would have put Rachel on the cast as well, but that didn't happen. Either way, I think the person that they did put on from the season is not only the right choice, but probably one of the only accurate choices that they could have put on this cast, and Twitter probably collectively pumped their fists when they figured out who it was, that of course being Genevieve. And Genevieve is one of the greatest characters from the new era and of the season. Everything about Genevieve is just kind of iconic, so Genevieve is the right choice from 47 to put on Survivor 50. Now, she did go pretty far last time, so it would be interesting to see how she does it again, especially considering the fact that Rachel isn't going to be on the season, so she's probably going to have to find a new arch nemesis. But we'll see how Genevieve handles the game. I am very much looking forward to it, as with most of the people that I've talked about. Probably more so with this pick. Call me a Genevieve stan all you want, I kind of am. So I know I've said this before, but I am very excited to see how Genevieve does on Survivor 50. And finally, we get to the most recent season of Survivor, that being Survivor 48, which also, like Survivor 46 and Survivor David vs. Goliath, had 3 people on the cast make the cast of Survivor 50. So once again, I'm going to be talking about all 3 of them in boot order, starting with Camilla, who I think has the potential to be a really great player on the return. She had a very under-the-radar strategy with Kyle that propelled her to the end, and I think if she does that and works on it more, she could be one of the greater players of the new era, and definitely a force to be reckoned with on Survivor 50. But then again, I don't know if she's going to put that strategy into overdrive or not. It seemed to work out for the most part on Survivor 48, but in this cast, when you're grouped with a bunch of legends, it might be harder to fly under the radar, whether it be intentional or not. So Camilla is definitely one of the people I'm more interested to see how she tweaks her strategy, along with people from the older seasons of Survivor. So we'll see what happens. Next up, we have someone who, if the edit is to be believed, even though it was a little bit misleading in this season, I feel like this person was always going to be on Survivor 50, whether or not they really played that well. And again, this person's game might not have been entirely intentional, but I actually have a soft spot for this person, and that person is Joe. And again, say what you will about Joe as a player, whether he played too honorably or whether he played without much strategy, but again, I just really have a soft spot for Joe, and I am very looking forward to seeing him on Survivor 50. I really thought the whole dynamic he had with Eva was just very heartwarming, especially considering that I am an autistic person myself, so to see the bond that he had with Eva is something that I think is just hard to put into words, especially the episode where Eva had her first meltdown. This was the one before the fire making challenge. This is the one where she struggled in the immunity challenge and eventually succeeded, but was still really overwhelmed by the whole ordeal, which led to probably the most emotional moment in Survivor history alongside Rudy's elimination in All Stars, and is also a moment that made me shed a couple of tears. And I'm not one to cry usually, but this moment made me cry. He did play pretty well on Survivor 48, although he was not the best player this season. I'm not even going to sugarcoat it. He did play pretty honorably though, but in Survivor 50, he's going to need to play with a lot more strategy, especially considering, spoiler alert, Eva is not on the cast. So what he's going to do, I have no idea, but I would be interested to see how he tweaks his strategy for the new season. And the last member of Survivor 48 to be on Survivor 50 is someone who I kind of expected to be on the list, but not entirely, and that is the winner of the season in Kyle, who, again, Kyle played the best game in 48. He flew under the radar, and with the strategy that he developed with Camilla, managed to go all the way to the end and win the season. However, that's the problem. Kyle won a season, and I know that he's going to go into the season with a huge target on his back for being a former winner. Now, maybe he can pull some strings and find a way to navigate through the game despite being a former winner. It has happened before. Look at Tina in Blood vs. Water. But again, it's not a guarantee. He could be taken out very early due to his status, or he could find a way to navigate through the game, make it to the merge, or possibly even the end again, though I personally don't see it as very likely. Kyle is a very good player and one of the best players from the new era alongside Dee, again, who also won the game, but it's threat management that's going to play a huge factor into how people see Kyle on Survivor 50. So we'll see if Kyle's game is more comparable to that of a winner from All Stars or from one of the better players of Winners at War. Before I end this video off, I want to briefly touch upon Survivor 49, which as of the time of recording has not aired yet, but is confirmed to have produced 2 returning players for Survivor 50. And if I had to take a guess, I would say that one of them is a major character and the other one makes a pretty deep run, possibly a winner, but not a guarantee, and also could be a very interesting character as well. Once Survivor 49 does air, there is the possibility that I do make a video on the 2, although maybe not because it would have to be really short, but once I know for sure, I'll give my thoughts on them eventually. In any case, that'll do it for my review of the Survivor 50 cast, which again, I think is a very good cast. There's definitely a lot of potential for some of the names, even though some of the picks were definitely a little bit questionable. So that'll do it for the video. My name's Owen, and I'll catch you guys next time in the front yard. Take care.